Thank you so much for your interest in this topic of zero-day vulnerabilities. Today's talk is part policy, part exploit development. It's in those two different tracks. So I'll give you a taste of policy topics regarding zero-day vulnerabilities, as well as talk about some technical details of zero-day vulnerabilities based on data that I analyzed. Zero-day vulnerabilities are often shrouded in secrecy. Sometimes, often people ask if 0 days are a zero-sum game, where one side only wins and the other side loses. 0 days, on one hand, can be useful to those testing defenses or planning offensive operations. They can also lead to unsecure platforms and increase risk for businesses, consumers, and the public. This leads to the question of what one should do when they find a zero-day vulnerability. Should they retain or disclose? Governments face a risk-reward trade-off in deciding whether to keep the vulnerabilities that they find a secret. And this decision has implications beyond national security. It touches on the legal system, company liability, and consumer protection. It might seem counterintuitive to some, or it may seem obvious to some, but the interests of national intelligence are sometimes at odds with the public. If a government keeps a vulnerability that they find secret to use as a weapon against an adversary, then the software maker can't patch it, and consumers and companies might get hacked. So it's a debate among policymakers. Should a government keep the 0 days they find a secret so that their information security folks can use them both for offensive or defensive purposes? Well, this might leave the public and businesses vulnerable. Or should a government disclose the 0 days that they find so that they can get patched? Businesses and consumers might be safer, but then that government loses a potential weapon. So it's a dilemma for policymakers, and there's just not much hard evidence and hard metrics to help them answer the question, retain or disclose. Today I'm going to tell you how we're helping to answer a piece of that question. The retain versus disclose question is complicated. The decision calculus is complicated. Until recently, at least in the United States, not much was known about this process. In other parts of the world, not much is known about this process either. In terms of the US, only recently, on November 15th, 2017, so just a few weeks ago, the US White House released or published their guidelines on the vulnerabilities equity process. That is, the considerations that they take into account when in possession of a 0-day vulnerability to examine whether to retain knowledge of the vulnerability or whether to publicly disclose information about the vulnerability. This charter discusses how there are many equities to consider: defensive, intelligence, law enforcement, and operational equities, commercial equities, and international partnership equities. Each of these equities has their own valid and unique interests, sometimes at odds with each other. And with each of these equities, there are many variables at play. And there are lots of questions that decision makers need to ask when deciding whether to retain or disclose. These include things like getting information about the product that the vulnerability is in. So, for example, the relationship that the vendor has with the government, how widely the product is used and where it is used, what accesses are required to exploit that particular vulnerability, the likelihood of a vendor to release a patch, the likelihood of a public to apply the patch. Also, it's good to know information about the threat actor that might take advantage of the vulnerability. So, for example, the likelihood of a particular threat actor's use of that vulnerability. the likelihood of their ability to exploit the vulnerability to begin with, what accesses the threat actor might have, or need, or possess. Also, one might want to know information about the use of the vulnerability in operations. For example, the value for intel collection, the current and future value in planning future operations, and the risks of revealing sources and methods about finding that vulnerability. Certainly, one wants to know information about the vulnerability itself. So how likely is it for someone else to discover or acquire knowledge about the vulnerability? How severe is the vulnerability? And other information, like will enough businesses and consumers install and apply the patch to offset the harm caused by educating attackers about that particular vulnerability? These are just a few of those things that are examined as part of the United States vulnerabilities equities process. So my research and this talk examines the zero-day vulnerabilities themselves. In particular, we examined the characteristics of zero-day vulnerabilities. Now, a challenge with examining 0 days is that publicly available information about them is sparse. As I mentioned, only until recently were the guidelines released of what the government does when they have a vulnerability. So a goal is to create some baseline metrics on the characteristics of zero-day vulnerabilities using actual zero-day data in order to help policy and technical information discussions. Now, other research on zero-day vulnerabilities exists to help fill the information void. But they have different methods. Some use simulated data, and they have heuristic models. Others examine zero-day vulnerabilities that are already in the public domain. Our research adds to the public knowledge by providing a rigorous empirical analysis of actual zero-day vulnerabilities and their exploits. We did this through a dataset that I acquired of information about more than 200 zero-day vulnerabilities, over half of which are still publicly unknown. With this dataset, I wanted to examine a number of research questions. In particular, 3 main research questions that I examined are the life status. This answers the research question of who knows about a vulnerability. Longevity. This answers the research question of how long a vulnerability will remain privately known before becoming publicly detected and disclosed. And collision rate. This answers the research question of, given knowledge of a group of vulnerabilities, how many, what percentage get independently rediscovered and publicly disclosed? So today, I'd like to explain my research focus, give a brief overview of our data, a quick deep dive into some of the details, not examining those 3 research questions, share some of our key findings on life status, longevity, and collision rate, and then go into some implications of our research. And I'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So when we think about those who search for vulnerabilities, there are, at the highest level, 2 groups, private and public. Those who search for vulnerabilities for private use, and those who search for vulnerabilities in order to make them public knowledge. If we focus on those who search for vulnerabilities for private use, we can, at this simplest level, split these up into 2 opposing groups. We'll call them us and them, where them is anyone that's malicious. These are adversarial nation states, cyber criminals, bad actors. And us is us and our allies, the good gals. Sometimes different groups find the same vulnerability. This is the overlap you see here, or what I referred to earlier as the collision rate. What's in the overlap and the characteristics of the vulnerabilities in this overlap, especially between the 2 private opposing groups, is a big unknown and helps fuel the discussion of what one should do when they find that vulnerability, retain or disclose. Disclosing and fixing the vulnerabilities that are known to both us and them would strengthen our defense, because then they couldn't use those vulnerabilities against us. But disclosing and fixing the vulnerabilities that are known only to us and not to them would hurt our offensive capabilities, because then we wouldn't have any 0 days that we could use against them, and they may still have some vulnerabilities they can use against us. Now, the big question is what vulnerabilities are in this overlap, the characteristics of the 0 days in this overlap, but also how large or how small that overlap is. A great deal of overlap would support the argument for disclosure. But if the overlap is relatively small, then these two groups are finding different vulnerabilities. And if we disclose what we have, it leaves us in a weaker state. And here, retention may be the better argument. Now, ideally, we'd want to know what 0 days we have and what 0 days they have to examine the overlap. We don't have that data. What we do have is one private data set, which we can compare to public data in order to create some baseline metrics on the characteristics of 0-day vulnerabilities. Our data come from a vulnerability research group we're calling BUSBY to protect its anonymity. Many of BUSBY's researchers have worked for nation states. Many of their products are used by nation states. So we consider this data set to be a proxy for the capabilities and skill level of a sophisticated private use group or a nation state. As such, BUSBY is a proxy for us. Our research focuses on the 0-day characteristics and the overlap of BUSBY with the public. You may be wondering, or perhaps not because we're in England, what BUSBY is. It's a cover term that I came up with. It's a type of hat. And it's a play on the white hats and the black hats that we have in the information security world. If you go down to Buckingham Palace, you can see one of these in person, which is pretty cool. So BUSBY finds 0-day vulnerabilities and develops exploits for them. BUSBY has vulnerability researchers who, as I mentioned, have worked for nation states, developed products for nation states, but also have their own capabilities and techniques, their own skill levels on particular products, on particular bug hunting techniques. I cultivated a relationship with BUSBY over the course of several years. On the condition that we didn't identify them, BUSBY offered rare access to their data on 0-day vulnerabilities. They retained no control over our use of the data, our analysis, or our findings. Our data contain 14 years worth of information about more than 200 0-day vulnerabilities and their exploits from 64 different vendors. As I mentioned before, over half of the vulnerabilities still aren't publicly known. And we believe that the only data sets on the same plane as ours are likely classified. Our data consists of information about vulnerability class, source code type, exploit class type, vendor, product, who the exploit developer was, and then various states. When the exploit developer found a vulnerability, which we call a birth date, when the exploit developer developed a fully functional exploit for that vulnerability, which we call a mature date, and if that vulnerability was found by someone else and publicly disclosed, we call that a death date. Essentially, we're treating our vulnerabilities like humans, and we're anthropomorphizing them. Taking a deeper dive into our data, examining our data in terms of vulnerability type. The majority of vulnerabilities were memory corruption vulnerabilities. And we broke each vulnerability type into further subcategories. I'll go into each one of these briefly just to give you an idea of the type of data we had. I will also note that all of this research is available in a publicly available, freely available report with more of these charts. So in terms of memory corruption vulnerabilities, we had 6 different subtypes. You can see, likely not surprisingly, that most of them, most commonly, were heap or stack overflows. Now, some exploits relied on more than one type of vulnerability or a combination of vulnerabilities. That's what you see in the bottom 2 rows. We had 13 subcategories for memory mismanagement vulnerabilities. Most commonly in our data set were null dereference and information leak vulnerabilities. You can see a few privilege escalation, use after freeze, as well as other types. We had 23 subcategories for logic vulnerabilities. By far, the most popular here in our data set were race condition vulnerabilities, followed by authentication bypass, privilege error, and object injection. In terms of code base, code bases in our data set were more often closed than open. Some source code type was of unknown. The vendor was obfuscated for our analysis. We had vulnerabilities for 64 different vendors. Here on the left-hand side, I list the top vendors, or here in general, I list the top vendors in terms of the number of vulnerabilities found. The top four vendors are on the left. For the other vendors, generally about 1 or 2 vulnerabilities were found or exploits developed. Now, because we know about the exploits as well as the vulnerabilities, we're able to look at the different types of exploits. So more exploits required prior access to a vulnerable system or human interaction to complete an action than those exploits that were remote access. I'll have some other observations about the data. 4% of the vulnerabilities in our data set were purchased from an outside third party. All of these purchased vulnerabilities had a short lifetime. I'll go in a little bit later what I mean by a short and long lifetime, but essentially these vulnerabilities died pretty quickly. Not all vulnerabilities in our data set had exploits developed for them. This was either because certain capabilities or conditions were required to be true for an exploit developer to develop that exploit, and so they were essentially putting that vulnerability on the shelf and waiting for that condition to be true, or the vulnerability researchers already had several exploits deep in a particular code base, and so it wasn't worth their time or their effort to develop yet another exploit for that particular code base. We found, interestingly, that CVEs do not always provide complete or accurate information about the severity of a vulnerability. So one can't always go off of what one sees in the NVD or any other kind of similar database. For example, in one particular case, the CVE listed the vulnerability as something that, when exploited, causes a denial of service. The BUSBY researchers found that that vulnerability could actually be exploited to cause a privilege escalation, which is something more severe. We saw that exploitability is fluid and can shift over time. Just because a vulnerability is not exploitable in one moment doesn't mean that it can't be the next day, and vice versa. So for example, one of BUSBY's exploits had a vulnerability that had been found in a 32-bit version of a product, and it was not exploitable. When that 64-bit version came out, the vulnerability was exploitable. You were able to access it and create an exploit for it. And that particular vulnerability lived for more than 5 years before a security patch was released. BUSBY had 12 vulnerabilities and exploits for hypervisors, virtual machines, and antivirus solutions. Of these 12 vulnerabilities, at the time of our information cutoff date, which was March of 2016, 75% of them were viable as exploitable and unknown vulnerabilities. I have a couple other observations about the data, and I have charts for these. When we looked at the time it took to develop an exploit, once a vulnerability had been found, we found that exploit development time is relatively short. So here I have on the x-axis the time in terms of days it took to develop an exploit. On the y-axis, going up and down, is the number of exploits developed by BUSBY researchers. Over 70% of the exploits were developed in a month or less. Almost a third, about 31%, were developed in a week or less. And we had about 10% of the exploits that took longer than 90 days. The max was 2.5 years, but really that was because they were waiting for those certain conditions to be true, and the vulnerability researchers kept on going back to that vulnerability to see if those conditions were true. We saw that time to develop an exploit did not have a bearing on how long the exploit lived, and no characteristic of an exploit indicated a long or short time to develop that exploit. We saw, good news for security defenders, that mitigations do have an impact on exploitability. The exploitation of different kinds of memory corruption vulnerabilities is a prime example of this. Here, stack-based exploits are in green, heap-based exploits are in blue. On the x-axis is when an exploit was developed for a particular vulnerability type. On the y-axis is the count of the vulnerabilities, or the exploits developed. You can see that more exploits were developed for the stack than the heap before 2007. Mitigations for the stack appeared around 2007, causing a shift to more heap-based exploits. You can see this with the tall blue line at 2007. Around 2010, more mitigations for the heap emerged, essentially evening out the bias. So what this tells us is exploit developers tend to zoom in on, or they can tend to zoom in on the types of vulnerabilities that are easier to exploit. When mitigations come up, they switch their tactics. And when more mitigations come up, they again switch their tactics. It's a cat and mouse game. In terms of the exploit developers themselves, we were able to map out the career span of BUSBY researchers during their time there. On the x-axis are the years when a particular researcher was at BUSBY. On the y-axis are the particular vulnerability researchers themselves, and in parentheses are the number of exploits that each of them developed. We saw the average career length at BUSBY was approximately 3.5 to 4.5 years. So this begs the question, is there a burnout rate for vulnerability researchers and exploit developers? We saw a high frequency of exploits developed in BUSBY's early years. One might surmise that there was a peak, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit, or a peak group of skills in BUSBY's early years. In particular, there may be some special sauce that researchers U, P, and I have, as they happen to develop the most exploits. Looking at just researchers U and P, for researcher U, she or he may have benefited from a number of low-hanging fruit. Their last exploit was developed in 2010, around the time that many in the exploit development community that I've spoken with agree that exploit development and mitigations for vulnerabilities started to increase dramatically, and more information about vulnerability research and bug hunting was publicly available. More books were out, people were talking at conferences about that. So perhaps this caused many of those vulnerabilities to be found more quickly. As of our information cutoff date, 1/3 of researcher U's vulnerabilities are still publicly unknown. In terms of researcher P, all of his exploits were for Linux. So as a result of this focus, she or he likely has a very deep understanding of Linux internals and the kernel that can enable this researcher to find vulnerabilities that are deeply hidden and likely aren't going to be found by others. Currently, there are almost an even split, half and half, of researcher P's vulnerabilities that are still publicly unknown and those that have been publicly disclosed. We also saw that the rate of exploit development is not steady. In some years, a researcher may or may not develop an exploit. So that's it on the quick deep dive into the data. Now I'm going to shift focus into those three aspects, those three research questions I mentioned earlier. Life status, who knows about the vulnerability? Longevity, how long a vulnerability lives? And collision rate, what percentage get independently rediscovered? So I'm going to get into these, but there are some caveats to our research. First, results from our research can be generalized only to similar data sets. Now, that said, we receive data from one source, BUSBY, But BUSBY is composed of a number of individual vulnerability researchers. So a diverse set of more than 20 exploit developers, many of which have their own focus and expertise. Also, our data don't include all vulnerability types and all products, but because of the nature of BUSBY, these data are relatively representative of those types of vulnerabilities that might be held by a nation state or might be selected for operational use. Now, the second caveat is that we're comparing private data to public data. Ideally, as I mentioned earlier, we'd want to compare multiple private data sets, multiple BUSBYs. So here, I'll put out a call to action that if you are a BUSBY or if you have access to BUSBY-like data, I would be thrilled to speak with you and see how I can help refine these research findings. Now let me get into the findings. So the first thing we examined were the various life stages of a zero-day vulnerability. This equates to understanding what vulnerabilities are unknown, so alive, dead, publicly known, or somewhere in between. Why do we care about life status? It tells us who knows about the vulnerability and whether or not that vulnerability is still considered a threat or asset, depending on your point of view, as a zero-day vulnerability. So we started by classifying our vulnerabilities as simply alive or dead. At the highest level, we saw an almost even split between those vulnerabilities that were alive or dead. But we discovered things that didn't quite fit into alive or dead, and we saw granularity within each of those categories. Among the vulnerabilities that are alive, some are still living. These are ones that are actively sought out by defenders. There are other vulnerabilities that are immortal. These are ones that will remain in a product in perpetuity because the vendor no longer maintains the code base or issues updates. So vulnerabilities in Windows XP are ones that we would consider immortal. Among the vulnerabilities that are dead, we classified them by how they died. The majority of our vulnerabilities died through a security patch or an advisory being released. In other cases, a researcher would post online in a blog or publish in a book information about a security vulnerability. No security advisory or patch went along with it, but because it was in the public domain, we considered it to have died. These are the ones that are publicly shared. And BUSBY decided to kill some of its own vulnerabilities. There are still other vulnerabilities that are quasi-alive. We call them zombie vulnerabilities, or these code refactored vulnerabilities, because due to code refactors, vulnerabilities live in the older versions, but not the latest version of a product. And some vulnerabilities in our data set were classified as uncertain. At the time of writing, BUSBY researchers were checking those vulnerabilities and their exploits against the latest version of a code to determine whether they were still alive or if they were zombie vulnerabilities. Next, we looked at the longevity of 0 days. How long do 0 days live? This is how long a 0-day vulnerability will remain in private knowledge before becoming publicly disclosed. Longevity is important because it tells us how long 0 days of this caliber exist before becoming publicly known. It can help those planning offensive operations against a hard target whose only way in is through that 0-day vulnerability know how long they have to plan out for. It can also help software vendors and security companies know how well they're doing at finding vulnerabilities in their own products. A short average lifetime would indicate that they're doing a good job at finding those vulnerabilities. A long average lifetime would indicate the opposite. For this part of the analysis, we cut down our data set to just those vulnerabilities that were alive or dead. So we cut out things that were immortal, and I'll explain why. You'll see why in a moment. And we only used vulnerabilities that had a birth date. As I mentioned earlier, we're essentially equating vulnerabilities to humans in order to do this kind of analysis. So we wanted to know what a short life, a long life, and an average lifetime of a 0-day vulnerability might be. Now, because some of our vulnerabilities are still alive, or currently publicly unknown. We can't just take the lifetime of vulnerabilities that are both dead and alive and take the average of them to see what the average lifetime is, because we still have things that are alive, and we don't know how long they'll live for. Will they die tomorrow, or will they live for another 10 years? It turns out that this is a common problem for those who try to calculate life expectancy in humans. So we turned to those methodologies. And specifically, we used Kaplan-Meier analysis. This is a commonly used method to estimate the probability of surviving from some event of interest over time. So with a human population, this might be the probability of surviving from a heart attack or not having a heart attack over time. In our data set, it's the probability or the likelihood of surviving from being disclosed, surviving from dying. So we plotted the survival probability of our data. On the x-axis here are the number of years that a vulnerability lived for, and on the y-axis is the survival probability. Using the 25th and 75th percentiles as thresholds, we found that 75% of vulnerabilities lived a year and a half or longer. So we deemed any vulnerability that had died before then to have a short life. We found that 25% of our vulnerabilities lived more than 9.5 years. So we defined any vulnerability to have a long life if it lived more than 9.5 years. The average life expectancy, or the life expectancy, is calculated by taking the area under the curve. We used an exponential model as the best estimate, and we found that the average life expectancy for a zero-day vulnerability is rather long, almost 7 years, or 2,521 days or nights, hence the title for our research, 0 Days, Thousands of Nights. We examined some other characteristics or some other questions related to longevity. One question, do certain characteristics of a vulnerability or exploit indicate a long or short life? Is there something, when I have a vulnerability in hand, that will tell me that this vulnerability is going to live for a long time before detection by others, or is it going to die relatively quickly? So we split up our vulnerabilities and examined them by different types, looking just at vulnerability type, the platform that it was in, the source code type, or the exploit class type. Plotting the Kaplan-Meier curves for each of those, looking at the curves for vulnerability type, we didn't see a sign of meaningful difference across their levels. For platform affected, because we had to stratify our data into so many different categories, again, no results stood out as statistically significant, although there were indications of Linux exploits, perhaps, or Linux vulnerabilities, perhaps living longer than other types of vulnerabilities. In terms of source code type, we saw that the curves for open and closed source were relatively similar. Again, the p-value is too high to say anything with statistical significance with high confidence. However, this indicates a hypothesis that we could test, that vulnerabilities for open source versus closed source have about the same average life expectancy. Finally, in the exploit class type, again, we were challenged by comparing or stratifying across so many different levels. There's no significant difference that we saw. However, our data do suggest that there might be value in collapsing this into two different groups, client-side and remote exploits, and comparing those against local, mixed, and other. We did a quick analysis of that. Again, didn't find anything statistically significant. As you can see, there's a theme here, and this is why I go to my call to action. If you have more data, we can certainly add to this and help to try to find more statistically significant results. So, do certain characteristics indicate a long or short life? Unsatisfyingly, it's unclear. More data is needed to refine the results. Another question that we asked was if life expectancy or survival probability changes over time. We saw earlier how mitigations can affect which vulnerabilities get exploited. And we have a good sense that vulnerabilities, that things have changed over time. There's been more access to knowledge about vulnerability development, or exploit development and vulnerability hunting. Unfortunately, again, because we had to stratify year by year, our results weren't statistically significant, but they did indicate that perhaps there is no difference in things over year by year. Again, more data can help refine the results. Our third main focus was examining collision rate. How many get independently rediscovered and publicly disclosed? Specifically, what percentage of 0 days known privately to one group will get independently rediscovered and publicly disclosed by another group? This is the overlap in the Venn diagram from earlier. Collision rates are important because they tell us how much overlap there is between what we find and what they find. So in our data set, over our entire 14-year time span, we found this overlap, this percentage, about 40%. This means that 40% of the vulnerabilities BUSBY found were also found and publicly disclosed by someone else. But that's over 14 years. And 14 years isn't a very useful measure for periodic evaluation of who knows about what vulnerabilities. An organization that retains vulnerabilities would likely flush out dead vulnerabilities in regular time intervals. So that's what we did. We examined various time intervals. Specifically, we chose time intervals of about a year, 6 months, and 90 days, thinking that this is probably a reasonable time period for someone who holds on to vulnerabilities to regularly flush them out. So the methodology is someone over a time period, a year, 6 months, or 90 days, would acquire, discover, and retain new vulnerabilities. And then at the end of the time interval, examined how many have been publicly disclosed, how many have died, throw out those that have died, keep those that have that are still alive, and then move on to the next time interval when the reevaluation begins again. Our collision rate is the median percentage of all of those that died over all time intervals. So for a time interval of 365 days or 1 year, this is what our data looked like. Now, this is a whole bunch of colors and numbers and things like that. What matters to you is red. Red are vulnerabilities that died that got publicly disclosed. So our collision rate is the median of all of those of the red. We found that our collision rate for a 1 year time interval was 5.7%, or approximately 6% of vulnerabilities get discovered year after year. So in a year, 6% of the vulnerabilities you consider known only to you will actually get discovered by someone else. If we drop that down to 6 months, the percentage, the collision rate, is about 2.8%. And if we drop it down to 90 days, that collision rate is less than 1%. You can see that changing the time interval drastically changes the collision rate. This is why it's very important to be careful about the time interval examined when discussing collision rate. Depending on one's point of view, you can make whatever claim you want. Beyond these three main research questions, we explored several other research paths with our data. For many of these, we weren't able to get statistically significant results, likely due to having to stratify our data into so many different categories. Again, more data, we can refine our analysis. Now, what do our findings for life status, longevity, and collision rate tell us? Labeling a 0 day vulnerability as either alive or dead, publicly unknown or publicly known, is too simplistic and can be misleading. There's benefit from being more granular when talking about a 0 days life status. 0 day vulnerabilities have a rather long average life expectancy of almost 7 years. And the percentage of privately known vulnerabilities that get independently rediscovered and publicly disclosed is relatively small, about 6% per year. But changing the time interval examined can drastically change the results. Given these key findings, there are implications and recommendations for those both in offense and defense. Those in defense should refine their tactical approaches. This includes things like searching previous versions of code bases that are still in use due to those code refactored or zombie vulnerabilities. And they may also benefit from studying and harnessing the techniques of those who are offensively focused and how private research groups find vulnerabilities, especially given that the private-public overlap is so small. So bug bounty programs and internal bug hunting programs may not be enough. Defenders also should consider strategic approaches. This includes employing physical isolation, not just virtual. Recall, BUSBY had 12 vulnerabilities and exploits for virtual machines, hypervisors, and AVs. Accounting for software and devices in an enterprise is useful, knowing what removable media has been where and when. Defenders should also consider incentivizing upgrading to new versions, as end-of-life products can have dormant vulnerabilities. Those are the immortal vulnerabilities. And certainly recognize that a compromise or an attempt at compromise is inevitable and aim to limit the impact of an exploit. For those offensively focused, it may be sufficient to retain a few vulnerabilities for a particular software package, given the long average life. Vulnerabilities that are immortal or refactored zombies may still be of value for operations. And researchers should consider regularly revisiting vulnerabilities they had once thought to be unexploitable, because exploitability can certainly change day by day. Now, what do these findings mean for the retain versus disclosure discussions? Long average lifetimes and relatively low collision rates may indicate that either vulnerabilities are dense, another vulnerability can usually be found, or vulnerabilities are really hard to find, with these two things not necessarily mutually exclusive. If vulnerabilities are dense, so another vulnerability can be found, then the level of protection from disclosing one vulnerability may be seen as modest because another vulnerability can be found. If vulnerabilities are hard to find, then one can make the argument that the small probability of rediscovery by others supports the argument for retention. That said, collision rates for zero-day vulnerabilities are non-zero. They're greater than zero. And if there's any probability that a bad actor will find that same vulnerability, then the consequences of leaving that vulnerability open and able to be found and exploited are of a greater risk to the public. Therefore, disclosure is the best option. So beyond this, decision makers across public and private sectors are asking questions related to zero-day vulnerabilities. I hope these are some questions that you are taking back and answering or asking yourself about zero-day vulnerabilities. Should we prioritize national security or consumer safety and company liability? What's the role a government should play in protecting commercial enterprises? Is it the government's responsibility to protect the consumer? Should they even have to disclose? How far does that reach? Should software companies be liable for security vulnerabilities in their products? What is the responsibility for software companies? Should they be required to patch holes they know about within a certain period of time? What happens if consumers don't patch those vulnerabilities? And what is the impact to a business's risk profile? Since zero-day vulnerabilities live about 7 years before detection and public disclosure, companies may be amassing huge amounts of liability, especially if consumers get hurt using their product. So how should companies be dealing with that? Companies may need to reevaluate how much they're spending on bug hunting and removal and where they're spending elsewhere. So these are just a few of the questions that decision makers are facing. The decision calculus of whether to retain or disclose is complicated. There are so many players involved, so many questions that need to be asked. Our intent is not to resolve the debate. Our goal is to have one little piece that we can help to inform the debate by using real-world data to create some baseline metrics on the characteristics of zero-day vulnerabilities in order to help inform the policy discussion. So I'll close out here, leaving the key findings up, and I welcome your questions.
Hi, great talk, thank you. You mentioned that reasons for killing vulnerabilities, BUSBY actually killed 4% of them themselves. Did they elaborate on why they would do that?
Yeah, where are you? So I'm not just looking.
So, over here.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yes, there's a number of reasons why a vulnerability research group might kill their own vulnerabilities. One reason, and these aren't necessarily the reasons that BUSBY uses, these are just the possible reasons. It can be a badge of honor to release and disclose a vulnerability in the information security community. And so if there's a hint that someone else has found the same vulnerability that you know about, and it's of perhaps little value to retain that vulnerability or knowledge, it may be useful to put that into public knowledge. In other cases, it may also be useful as a marketing play to show people how good you are at finding vulnerabilities. Again, if it's a vulnerability you're willing to give up, it may be something that you can show a customer, perhaps in the public domain, not necessarily a nation state, but maybe a business commercial company, where that vulnerability is in their product, and then publicly disclose it.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a related question. Do you know what fraction of the publicly disclosed vulnerabilities were disclosed anonymously?
What percentage of people disclose vulnerabilities?
Anonymously.
Anonymously.
Yeah. And do you have any reason to believe that some of the vulnerabilities in the collision sector were actually disclosed anonymously by a BUSBY researcher that would potentially skew the real collision rate?
That's a very good question. Could any of the vulnerabilities that were publicly disclosed or that I considered died not killed by BUSBY to have perhaps been from BUSBY?
Yeah.
I very confidently can say no, simply because of the type of relationship that I developed with BUSBY. Certainly maybe they wanted to keep that from me, but that's I'm very confident that just the nature of how our data collect happened and how I was able to determine whether a vulnerability was alive or dead, I don't believe that's the case.
No, but I meant, for example, a researcher without the knowledge of the company, without the knowledge of BUSBY, decided that it's better for public to disclose it, and they went ahead and did that.
Without telling BUSBY that they were going to disclose it. Sure, they could have. I think that's, I'm not sure why someone would. If I were being employed by a company and I want to continue to make money, I don't know why I would publicly disclose. Perhaps for the benefit of the information security community. If we're talking purchase price, the purchase price for a zero-day vulnerability in the private use group is about 10 times the purchase group of a zero-day vulnerability in the public knowledge group. And so, not saying that they was trying to get purchased in the public knowledge group, but financially, it's more worth one's while to keep secret about a vulnerability.
Okay, thank you.
Great talk, thank you very much. What was the incentive for BUSBY to share all that data with you? I mean, what did they get out of it? That's
a great question. publicly available research about 0 days in general is sparse. And research that has been done that helps to inform policy discussions generally relies on expert opinion, subject matter experts talking, people looking at manufactured data, or someone looking at data that's already disclosed, publicly available. So BUSBY, I think, saw an incentive to get research based on actual data, actual hard metrics. As I mentioned before, they had no skin in our game in the sense that whatever results we published are the results that we published. That happens to be the nature. I work currently at the RAND Corporation. That's the nature of our work. We put out research. We are incredibly objective and nonpartisan, and we publish whatever research we have, even if it angers some groups or not. It's simply what we want to do. We want to help inform public policy discussions with data. So I think BUSBY saw the benefit, perhaps, of being able to provide data. I did speak to other BUSBY-like entities who were exploring the opportunity or were exploring the possibility of sharing their data. I'm still trying to go down those paths. I think that just helps us be so much smarter talking about 0-day vulnerabilities. And I was very thankful that a group that had access to this data saw the benefit of having that data out there in the public. It looks like there's a question in the back.
Yes, fantastic presentation, very interesting. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who thinks this was very interesting. So have you seen any effects from this on the political debate after you published this research?
In terms of the impact, I do know that this research has circulated among various channels. On the U.S. side, one of our U.S. representatives asked for a copy of this report shortly before proposing a particular act, the Protecting Our Ability to Counter Hacking or Patch Act. That's Representative Ted Lieu, for those interested. And I do know that I don't know what happens behind closed doors, but I do believe this research has circulated among various channels and perhaps was, I hope, was perhaps used in terms of the discussions that revolved around the vulnerabilities equity process. I'm really not sure specifically because I've kept myself away from what policymakers are actually doing behind the closed doors. But that is absolutely the intent, to have impact with this research. If you have entrees into other policymakers, I'd be more than happy to come and talk to them, share this research, or discuss more things regarding 0-day vulnerabilities and the policy questions.
Hi, very interesting talk. And somehow related to this, is there any ongoing work to come up with recommendations or maybe requirements for groups like BUSBY to how they should secure their computer systems, where they keep all these sensitive, perhaps non-public vulnerabilities?
So we did come up with recommendations, and for both those in offense and defense for each of our three. We actually had 4 main research questions. In terms of securing the actual systems that hold exploit code or hold information about the vulnerabilities themselves, we didn't come up with recommendations on that. That certainly is something that is an obvious question that comes up, or is something that one would want to look at. We didn't look at actually securing the vulnerabilities. Looks like there's someone right here.
Hi, great research. Question regarding, do you know who were BUSBY's customers or their domain? Is it a state, nation states, or just private commercial or anything?
So because BUSBY wanted to, their condition was that we don't identify them, what I've talked about in this talk is what I can talk about. I'll put out another call if you do have access to other BUSBY-like places. I would love to talk with them to help refine this research. Hopefully this research can give a sense for how sensitive we are to holding the data and how careful I am with not attributing places. I'm also very interested to talk to the vulnerability researchers themselves. If you are a vulnerability researcher or an exploit developer, I would love to talk with you. We got data from BUSBY, but I was able to talk to about a dozen different bug hunters or vulnerability researchers of this kind of caliber to get anecdotal kind of information. And while I'm focused on the hard data, anecdotes are interesting. I'd like to get more hard data, but I'd also like to get more anecdotes. Well, it looks like that's my time. Thank you so much for yours.